So, hi everybody. Thank you so much for coming here. It's really nice to be here and to see so many of you with an interest in these topics. So, did you know that the Nhs carbon footprint is 22.8 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents? This is about 25% of England's public sector emissions. So in the pharmaceutical sector, this could apply to carbon embodied in a particular drug, to chemical waste that's being disposed by a supplier, or to the release of greenhouse gases from an inhaler used by patients. And this is important because the NHS estimates that about 60% of emissions is due to people using or buying prescribed drugs. The point I want to make is this. Excessive overdiagnosing of mental health disorders may lead to an increase in prescription of all sorts of medicines, thereby increasing the ecological footprint of our NHS substantially. So I'm a psychologist, and we use this book called the DSM. And in this book, all the mental health disorders are listed, and we use it for diagnosis. So some time ago, Alan Francis and his task force were working on a new version of this book because it's constantly being updated. So we're now at its 5th version. But the example I want to talk to you about is about ADHD and about the move from the DSM-3 to the DSM-4. So this task force was working on a new version of the DSM, and they wanted to make this minor change to the criteria for ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And they estimated that this minor change would lead to an increase of about 15% of people being diagnosed with ADHD. And they considered that to be okay. It would just mean that the system would become a bit more sensitive to detect people who were clearly suffering in important life areas. So DSM-4 was published, including this change. But at the same time, in the US, the pharmaceutical industry got approval from the government for making adverts for registered pills. So from that moment, there were commercials on TV and adverts everywhere, and they might look something like this. So you might see a poster with a bit of a theatrical child's drawing, and it might have some slogans on there saying, ADHD affects more than your grades, or ADHD medication can improve your academic performance. And most of these posters were aimed to sensitize parents' uncertainties regarding their children. For instance, being worried that they were not finishing their homework or were acting overly playful. And the message that all of these commercials had was basically, if you think your child has ADHD, please go to see your GP. We have ADHD medication that can solve the problem. So what do you think happened to that estimated 15% increase of ADHD diagnoses? Does anybody dare to give an estimate? How much do you think the percentile change really was? 30, right. Actually, it was 300%. And a reason that this can happen is because we have so few biomarkers. And with biomarkers, I mean there's no blood or urine test we can do or brain scan we can observe to test whether we are suffering from a mental health disorder, which makes that label, in nearly all cases, quite subjective. So my area of expertise is about dissociation and the relation with sleep. And I've been studying this topic for over 7 years now, both in the Netherlands and here in Oxford. Dissociation is about feeling detached from yourself or your surroundings. And it happens to most of us from time to time, in mild forms at least. So I think most of you will recognize the feeling of driving home from work, the same route you drive every day, and then suddenly realizing that you have no recollection for some parts of your journey. right? You didn't miss any traffic lights though, you didn't crash your car. It just kind of went on automatic pilot. Does anybody recognize this? Yeah, so this is a mild form of dissociation that we call absorption. People who are suffering from more severe forms of dissociation might have trouble recognizing themselves in the mirror. Okay, again, some of you may recognize this after having a late night out and coming across your mirror image in the morning, but that's more about maybe not wanting to recognize yourself. Yeah? So the problem with diagnosing these mental health disorders, whether we're talking about ADHD or dissociative disorders, is that they're a dimensional problem. So they range on a continuum from mild to severe. But we're using a categorical approach to do this, because you either have it or you don't. And we use this book, the DSM, where all these criteria are listed. And if you tick enough symptoms of the list, then that means you're suffering from the disorder. Take, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder. The DSM states that you need to suffer from at least 8 out of 19 symptoms in order to be diagnosed with this disorder. If you then do this really complicated mathematical formula, it quickly shows that there are 636,120 ways to have post-traumatic stress disorder. Can you imagine the consequences for prescribing anti-anxiety medication? So let's consider this problem of the carbon footprint again. 1, we're overprescribing drugs and too many drugs are being sold. And 2, our system for classifying and labeling mental health disorders might not be the best approach, and it might lead to overdiagnosis of disorders, thereby increasing the ecological footprint substantially. So mind you, talking about these labels, we're not just doing this in the mental health sector. It seems like we are using all these psychopathological terms in our everyday language. So nowadays, people can come out with these statements such as, oh, he almost gave me a panic attack, or I'm feeling a bit bipolar today. Yeah, it seems like we're labeling everything. So what can we do to improve sustainability in mental health? Because I think it's time for a change. Now let's consider these dissociative disorders again. Although it is really marvelous that we have all these brilliant minds working on improving medication all of the time, unfortunately, for dissociative disorders, most drugs don't seem to have much effect. Now, my research has been about connecting dissociation to sleep disturbances, because people who suffer from these disorders tend to sleep quite poorly. And as it turns out, by improving their sleep, we're able to reduce dissociation. And I can hear what you're thinking. We can improve sleep by prescribing sleep medication, right? But what I'm pleading for is that we as mental health professionals could focus more on social prescriptions. Eco-friendly alternatives that have proven useful, rather than drug prescriptions that leave a considerable footprint. There are ways of improving sleep using sleep hygiene that have proven just as effective as sleep medication, which, by the way, can be very addictive as well. So sleep hygiene is all about employing these routines that will help us to sleep better. So you would advise people to not drink coffee in the evening, have plenty of exercise during the day, preferably outside, go to bed at the same time every night, and perhaps most difficult, refraining from alcohol in the evening. All of these combined will improve your sleep, thereby reducing psychological symptoms. Or, if we put it in the very wise words of Ronald Reagan, who said, "I never drink coffee at lunch. I find it keeps me awake for the afternoon." So let's also consider nature. Feeling connected with nature is related to mental wellness. So going out for a walk in the woods or joining a running group not only will benefit your sleep and your physical health, but your mental well-being in general. One other example of where our natural responses come in the mix is this. Suppose you have to go to the emergency department because you've been in an accident. You're physically all right, but you feel pretty shaken up. That means you're feeling restless and agitated. So what do clinicians in A&E typically do? They will prescribe you some sleep medication so that you can sleep and feel better in the morning. However, recent studies we conducted here in Oxford actually show that if you are awake for that first night after having gone through a trauma, it actually helps you in terms of having less intruding memories directly after. So maybe this is our body's way of telling us that we need to be agitated and perhaps we need to sleep poorly for a night in order for us to cope naturally with what has happened to us, rather than trying to treat these symptoms with sleep medication. So the point I want to make is this. We need to normalize the way we view mental health. We need to stop trying to categorize a dimensional problem. We need to stop labeling mental health complaints into little boxes. And we need to stop this trend of using all these psychological symptoms in our everyday language. What we do need is stepped care, starting with normalization of complaints, then minor low-frequency interventions, and only if necessary, moving on to drug prescriptions. Try sleep hygiene interventions first before moving on to sleep medication. In dissociative disorders, this link with sleep has been well evidenced, and it's an avenue worth pursuing. So, the idea is that mental health should be connected more to being connected with community. And to be sustainable, we could use the resources around us and in nature. So, for example, having a dose of nature in therapy by joining a community garden group. Interventions like these have proven successful to reduce anxiety, depression, delusions and schizophrenia, and aggression in dementia. So, in summary, spending time in nature, participating in developments that contribute to sustainable communities, and making simple changes in your life, such as employing a good sleep hygiene, can all contribute to positive mental health. Now, I'll be starting my own experiment in a couple weeks from now. I remember from when I had my first child that I will get pretty sleep deprived. And there may be times where I don't recognize myself in the mirror. I guess people who say they sleep like a baby usually don't have one. Thank you so much for your time. Good night.